This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, preparing for rapid development and a fight for control of the critical d4 and e4 squares. This move directly challenges white's central pawn, initiating one of the most fundamental and balanced openings, the open game, aiming for rapid development and active piece play. This move develops a piece towards the center, immediately challenging black's e5 pawn and preparing for castling, a fundamental opening principle. This move, nc6, is a fundamental developing move that defends the e5 pawn, a common strategy in many classical openings like the Ruy-Lopez and Italian game. This move develops the knight to a natural square, supporting the central pawn and preparing for further development, often leading into the common and strategically rich four knights game or the Italian game, depending on black's response. This move signals a transition into a fianchetto-based defense, often seen in systems like the King's Indian attack or certain variations of the Perk defense, aiming to control the long diagonal with the bishop. This central pawn thrust directly challenges black's setup, aiming to open lines and exploit the kingside pawn majority after black potentially develops the bishop to g7, creating dynamic imbalances. This capture opens the center and accepts the challenge of black's King's Indian defense setup, leading to dynamic possibilities and a race for central control. This move challenges black's central control and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming to develop aggressively in the spirit of the four knights game. The move 5, bg7 is a logical continuation of the King's Indian defense setup, developing the bishop to its fianchettoed square where it exerts pressure along the long diagonal towards white's queenside. This move prepares to castle kingside, develops a piece actively, and supports the central pawn push, fitting into standard development principles of the opening. This move solidifies the pawn chain and prepares to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop, typical of certain variations of the four knights game or even transposing towards a King's Indian defense setup. This move connects the rooks and prepares to castle kingside, while also supporting the central pawn push of d4 and potentially aiming the queen towards the kingside. This move develops the knight to its most natural square, reinforcing the central pawn and preparing to castle kingside, which is a standard defensive and development strategy in this variation of the four knights game. Castling queenside initiates a sharp, opposing side pawn storm battle, mirroring the aggressive spirit of the two knights' defense's more tactical variations. This move challenges white's bishop on e3 and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses if white exchanges. This move exchanges a knight for a knight, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside by doubling the c-pawn after black recaptures. This move breaks black's pawn structure, creating doubled pawns on the c-file, but opens the b8-h2 diagonal for the bishop and strengthens the pawn center. This move strategically repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to exert pressure on black's queenside and potentially targeting weaknesses created by the pawn structure. This exchange of bishops on d4, while seemingly routine, simplifies the position and reinforces black's pawn structure, aiming to neutralize white's attacking potential on the kingside. This recapture opens the queen to the queenside file and prepares to contest the central pawn majority. This move develops the queen to an active square, eyeing white's c3 knight and preparing to potentially attack along the f-file if the central tension resolves favorably. This pawn advance immediately strikes at black's active knight, forcing it to retreat and disrupting its central influence. Trading queens here simplifies the position and leads to an endgame where black will have a queenside pawn majority, but white has an active king and potentially more space. This move maintains material equality and repositions the rook to an active file, preparing to contest control of the open d file. This move, 13, nay 3, attempts to leverage the newly created open files on the queenside and pressure white's weak c2 pawn, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially gain material or positional advantage. This move repositions the knight to a more active square on d1, aiming to redeploy it to f2 or e3 to support the kingside and contest the central files. Black's capture on d1 simplifies the position and aims to exchange off white's active knight, but it also opens the kingside for white's rooks and potentially creates a passed pawn for white if white can advance their kingside pawns. The king now occupies a more active central square, preparing to participate in the endgame and support the remaining pawns, while simultaneously defending the knight. This move begins to centralize the king and activate it for the endgame, a crucial step after the material has been simplified. This move solidifies the kingside pawn structure, preparing to develop the light-squared bishop and potentially launch a kingside attack while addressing the slight vulnerability created by the earlier pawn advance. This move, b6, develops the bishop to an active square, eyeing the d5 pawn and preparing to connect the rooks, a common goal after castling and simplification. White activates the bishop to a strong attacking outpost on a6, threatening the b7 pawn and gaining control of the long diagonal. This move develops the rook to an active file, creating potential pressure along the b file and preparing to challenge white's bishop, which currently holds a strong outpost on a6. This move aims to consolidate the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances on that flank, while also giving the king a bit more breathing room. This move aims to create active counterplay on the queenside by challenging white's central pawn majority and opening lines for black's rook. This rook move aims to activate the piece by targeting the c5 pawn and potentially supporting a future advance of the a pawn to control the queenside. The king seeks safety and centralize its position, aiming to participate in the endgame and support the rook on the b file while preparing for future pawn breaks. The king relocates to a more secure central square, preparing for potential kingside action while also eyeing the open d file. This move repositions the king to a more active square, preparing to support the pawn advance on the queenside and potentially contest the open c file. The king moves to c3, centralizing itself to support potential pawn advances and prepare for the rook to become more active along the c file. The king actively seeks safety and centralized squares, preparing to potentially support the pawn majority on the queenside. This move shores up the queenside pawn structure, preventing black's c pawn from advancing further and preparing to contest the open b file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, controlling the long diagonal and preparing to challenge white's rook on the b file, while also supporting a potential advance of the c pawn. This rook move repositions the rook to the a file, potentially preparing to contest the open file or to swing over to the kingside if opportunities arise, while also offering some protection to the b3 pawn. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the a3 f8 diagonal and potentially support pawn advances on the kingside if white's rook vacates the a file. White repositions the rook to a more active square on the fourth rank, aiming to potentially harass black's queenside pawns or support a future advance. The bishop returns to d7, defending the b5 pawn and preparing to potentially redeploy to a more active square or support a central pawn break. This move, Ra 3, is a repetition of white's previous move, indicating a lack of progress and a potential hesitation to commit to a concrete plan, perhaps waiting for black to reveal their intentions. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it pressures white's queenside pawns and prepares to control the a-file after a potential pawn advance. This exchange simplifies the position by eliminating black's bishop pair, which can be a significant advantage in open positions, and opens the b-file for white's rook. The capture of the bishop on a6, though forcing, creates a passed pawn for white and opens up black's king position. This pawn break aims to open lines for the rook and potentially create a passed pawn on the queen side, exploiting the advanced position of black's king. The king's journey to the queenside is nearly complete, aiming to centralize and participate actively in the endgame battle, though it must remain vigilant against potential checks. This move forces the black king to move again, disrupting its defensive posture and potentially opening lines for white's rook and king to infiltrate the queenside. This move aims to contest the open a-file and prevent white's rook from dominating it, while also preparing to potentially exchange rooks if white maintains pressure. This move initiates a pawn race, driving the black king into a less active position and potentially creating a passed pawn for white, if black is not careful with their king's safety. This move secures the king from further checks along the a-file and prepares to connect the rooks, aiming to activate them on more central files. This move activates the white king, bringing it closer to the center to support the upcoming pawn advance and contest control of the crucial central squares. The rook on e8 is centrally placed, controlling the open e-file and supporting the pawn break with c4 to open lines for the remaining pieces. White reiterates the rook's positioning to challenge black's d7 bishop, aiming to gain space and restrict black's piece mobility on the queenside. This pawn push aims to activate the f-pawn, potentially creating attacking chances on the kingside and opening lines for the rook if it can be supported. This pawn capture opens the e-file, potentially activating white's rook and creating threats against black's king and pawn structure. This pawn capture, gxf5, opens the g-file, activating the rook for potential attacking play on black's kingside, while also creating weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This rook move aims to contest the central open d-file, putting pressure on black's d6 pawn and preparing to support a potential kingside pawn advance. This move strategically repositions the rook to the second rank, aiming to control the open files and potentially create mating threats against white's king, while also supporting pawn advances. This move prepares to contest the crucial c-file, aiming to restrict black's rook activity and potentially create threats against the enemy king on the queenside. This move is a tactical blunder that sacrifices material for no clear compensation, neglecting the critical king's safety and allowing white to consolidate after a series of simplifying exchanges. This move repositions the rook to an active central file, creating immediate pressure on black's weakened kingside pawn structure and preparing to support a potential advance of white's central pawns. This move recaptures the pawn but centralizes the black rook on the open b-file, creating attacking potential against white's queenside pawns. This move is a logical consequence of the preceding exchanges, simplifying the material while gaining a pawn and creating a passed pawn on the queenside. This check aims to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and create counterplay for black's rook on the b-file. This move defends the rook and prepares to advance the passed pawn on the c-file, aiming to create further complications and potentially exchange material in a favorable way. This pawn capture, cxd5+, is a forced sequence that simplifies the position, leading to a rook and pawn endgame where white's king is more active and better placed than black's. This move recaptures the pawn, opening lines for the white king to become an active piece in the endgame, which is a crucial aspect of this position. This move re-establishes the king's mobility and prepares to challenge white's central pawn majority by potentially activating the king and supporting further pawn advances. The move k6 is a bold attempt to centralize the king and support the pawn majority on the kingside, aiming to create complications and potentially a passed pawn. But it must be carefully monitored as it exposes the king to potential threats if black can coordinate an attack. The king is making its final journey to the center to support its pawn structure and potentially engage in the endgame skirmishes. This rook maneuver aims to activate the rook to the a-file, potentially supporting further advances or defending against black's pawn push on the kingside. This move is a desperate attempt to disrupt white's king's safety by forcing checks, but it ultimately fails to achieve anything significant as white can easily consolidate the king's position. This king move is forced to avoid the check and aims to consolidate material after the exchange, although black still has a dangerous passed pawn on the c-file. This move is a greedy pawn grab that opens up the black king to powerful checks and potentially a rapid checkmate by white's king and rook. The white king activates, marching forward to support the passed pawn and contest the central squares, aiming to create decisive attacking chances. This move initiates a pawn race with the intent of creating a passed pawn on the queenside to challenge white's king and potentially force material concession or a draw through perpetual check. This move aims to reposition the king to a more active central square, preparing to support the pawn advances on the kingside and potentially challenge black's advanced d-pawn. This move pushes the pawn to a critical square, aiming to create a passed pawn on the d-file, which could become a significant endgame threat if the opponent's king cannot effectively blockade it. This move re-centers the king to safety after a series of forced exchanges, preparing to consolidate material and potentially activate the king in the endgame. This move aims to activate the rook on the open c-file and potentially support a pawn advance or prepare for further exchanges. White's 45. f4 aims to break open the center and activate the pawn chain, creating potential for breakthroughs with the king and pawns. This move, king to d5, attempts to consolidate the king's position and prepare for further pawn advances by creating a more stable central presence and potentially supporting the d-pawn. The king's active repositioning to d2 is crucial for supporting the passed pawn and coordinating with the remaining pieces to create a mating attack or force concessions. With the rook on g1, black aims to activate its remaining rook by potentially swinging it over to the kingside to create threats against white's king, or to support the advance of the f-pawn. This pawn advance seeks to create a passed pawn on f5 and attack black's king while maintaining some central control. This move, 47, c4, is a critical attempt to create a passed pawn on the c-file, aiming to disrupt white's king position and potentially create counterplay, although it risks weakening the d4 pawn. This rook move on the 7th rank prepares to challenge black's central pawn majority, aiming to open lines for white's king and potentially create play against black's king if it becomes exposed. This move attempts to exploit the exposed white king by creating a passed pawn with the support of the rook and the potential for a mating attack. This move aims to secure the king and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the queenside. Though white must remain vigilant against black's active king and central pawn majority. This move brings the black king back into the center of the board, aiming to support the advanced pawns and potentially participate in the defense of the critical d4 square. This move aims to activate the rook on the f-file, potentially supporting the pawn push and controlling key squares in the center and kingside. This move initiates a desperate attempt to use the king's activation and the passed c-pawn to create counterplay, but it's unlikely to be sufficient against white's overwhelmingly superior material and king's safety. The rook now retreats to c1 to safeguard the king and prepare to support the advancing f-pawn, which is crucial for creating a passed pawn. This rook move aims to capture a pawn and improve its position on an open file, but it overlooks the immediate tactical threat of white's king, which is currently vulnerable.